What's going on, YouTubers, gamers, and hobbyists, and welcome to this episode of Dungeons and Dragons, where we go over more things that you may need to get started. Now, the last video I spoke about the basics of what you need, and in this episode, we're going to go over some more stuff. But without further ado, we need to look at things that you would use anyway, whether you get like all the handbooks or whatever, or whether you just decide to stick with the basics. Now, of course, paper is a very essential part of any Dungeons and Dragons campaign, of course, as it is with any role-playing game. That goes without saying, you need paper. If nothing else, just to keep a track of your character's stats and or any notes that you may happen upon during your adventure. Now, for most uh, role-playing games that are theatre of the mind, which are literally your imagination alone, no miniatures, no models, nothing. It's vital because you can't be expected to remember everything that's going on, and especially for the games master, or in this case, the DM or dungeon master. Now, of course, this I'm sure is a very familiar sight to a lot of people out there, and for me in particular, this represented the particular dungeon or catacomb or whatever it was we were exploring. In fact, my very first ever game of Dungeons and Dragons, in which I played a halfling, and it was at the Dungeons and Dragons club in my school, my secondary school, which was kind of funny, and I might do a video on that at another time. But yeah, this was the kind of thing we were using. In fact, only one of us had a couple of miniatures, literally a couple, but for the most part, everything was represented by drawing down stuff on paper. Whether it was, I mean, in this instance, it's a blank sheet of paper, but sometimes it would have been a hexagonal grid, which can sometimes make things easier. So obviously, the path going along there enters into an opening, and that little circle, in the left-hand side of it, that could have represented monsters or treasure or traps or anything else, And then obviously you see two paths ahead of you, a fork left or right, and that's kind of the deal it was back in the day. Of course, there's nothing to stop you doing that now. And here we have a couple of miniatures, which was a fairly more common sight after a few months of playing, I suppose, when we got our hands on some figures. Of course, in the early days, they didn't have the round bases, they were on square bases, if they were on bases at all. Sometimes the lead or pewter had its own sort of base, ones you see these days that you would kind of rebase or put on one of these. But yeah, and as you can see, it got fairly crowded fairly quickly, and presumably the catacomb or dungeon would have been drawn slightly bigger anyway. But yeah, and unpainted as well, of course, which was the familiar sight. But this is how you start off. You're just engaging with your imagination. It represents, I mean, for what it's helpful for is obviously for party order, who's in front, who's behind, who gets attacked first, or sneakily, or what have you, who sets off traps. It's very, very handy, and it saves a lot of arguing later on. Now, this is a far more familiar site, I suppose, and is fairly commonplace for the majority of gamers out there, whether they're playing basic D&D, either from the start to set all the free rules. You want to engage your imagination a bit more and make it a bit more entertaining. So we're using painted miniatures, perhaps on a green cloth or just a plain table or something like that. But you can use this for no matter what system you're playing. Get yourself some miniatures. You don't need to base your miniatures off of characters you want to play necessarily, as long as they represent you, really. And I'll do another video on that and character creation later. I mean, I've already done a video on that kind of thing. If I remember, I'll link it in the corner. But I will do a much more updated one, and we'll come to that in due course. But of course, if you want to progress further, then you can add more to your imagination. And so finally, you can add bits of terrain to your tabletop, almost like a tabletop war game. And this is very, very engaging, particularly if you have like a major area or scene, whatever you want to call it, in your game. A major place where a lot of the story or game is going to revolve around, like in a big encounter or where the characters come back to. It doesn't really matter, but the point is, this for me is the way I like to do my Dungeons and Dragons role playing. So we kind of use a bit of just the figures and then add a few bits of scenery. Because I'm a war gamer, I can do that, and I can put like trees and whatnot around as well, and it looks really good, and it doesn't take too much time, but it's well worth it. So in the next video, I'll show you what could be the next stage for you on your journey, what you would look at getting. Anyway, thanks for watching. Remember, all brushes lead to war. Please look out for the next video or any other video. Please like, share, subscribe, and check out my Patreon if you've a mind. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now, folks. Bye bye.